All right, good afternoon. This is the lecture for Tuesday. What would it be? Tuesday, April 20. Well, no, 28th. That's right. Tuesday, April 28th. And so we have at our uh, class, our live class online on Friday. We kind of reviewed Cato. We reviewed the Gracchi brothers, and we um, looked at the rise of Sulla and basically the tyranny that and the civil war between him and Marius. So uh, this lecture is the first half of chapter 78. So basically pages 680 to 687. And here we're going to be really the major event is the formation of what the historians call the first triumvirate. Tri meaning three, and so basically it's a power sharing arrangement among Pompey, Crassus, and a guy by the name of Julius Caesar. So we're going to be talking about Caesar really for the next 2 weeks, his rise and fall. And of course, the triumvirate. There's nothing in the Republic, nothing in the Constitution of the Roman Republic that would allow for something like a triumvirate. But think about how far they have deviated and departed from the Republic since the Gracchi tried to kind of fix the problems of the class conflict. Sulla certainly, he marched his Marius runs for consul 6 straight times. Sulla uh, marches his army through the gates of Rome. He does not give up power. He calls himself a dictator because of the emergency of the Civil War, but he just maintains power as a dictator. He did not give it up after 6 months. Remember at the beginning of the class where we looked at Cincinnatus and this kind of ideal of the citizen farmer putting his plow down and then saving the republic from invasion and just going back home and being a humble farmer. That is not what is happening here. Sulla, he meets this very disgusting death. He's a decadent man, multiple marriages, multiple children out of wedlock, and he ends up dying of basically cirrhosis of the liver and infestation of lice all over his body. And so that, in some respects, is kind of where the republic is. It's a shell of itself. I think I said it's like a rotten tree in the forest that hasn't fallen down yet, and it needs a push. Well, Julius Caesar and the whole controversy surrounding him is that push that really shoves the republic into a permanent crisis which it never recovers from. But anyway, still, the republic is operating. They've got councils, they've got tribunes, they've got the Senate. So they've got all the trappings of it, but this triumvirate is working outside of the constitutional order, and they're the ones that are making the decision. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to know who was involved with the triumvirate, what their roles were, how they came to be in a position to actually cut such a political deal, power sharing arrangement, and then what are the consequences of that for Rome itself. Okay, so that's kind of where we are, and the dates kind of slowing history down a little bit. This is 78 BC. That's kind of right when Sulla dies, to 44 BC, and that's a date you just have to know. 44 BC, the Ides of March. That's when Julius Caesar was assassinated inside the Senate building. And because we do integrated history and literature, you guys are going to be starting very soon, not this week, but next week, you're going to be starting Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, which will be the last book that you read for the class. So there's going to be a really nice marriage between what you're learning in history and what you're learning in literature. Okay, so let's just dive in. And again, you'll have a Google form assignment from this that'll be due the following day, and I do want you to try to catch up on some of this work that you have not completed. We're going to slow down a little bit After we get through these two recorded lectures from Bauer, we're going to spend the next like 4 sessions, I believe, either reading from Plutarch, reading about Cicero, and also reading about Julius Caesar. And we won't have like a live lecture or a recorded lecture. You'll read half of this of the biography of Cicero, finish the next half, and then we'll have a live class, and we'll repeat the same process for Julius Caesar. So again, trying to slow down a little bit, give you some time to catch up and get those assignments done. And I do encourage you to do that because you need to, there's a lot of points on the table and you don't want zeros. Okay, so the first real big event that we need to talk about is what we call the Gladiator War. And so this is, we talked earlier that, what the Gracchi were trying to do was to redistribute land to small landowners. But with the failure of that, the rise of slavery continues inside Rome, and also diversions. You think about sports today. The fact that we don't have them, but you think about how much time and effort and focus people have on sports. Well, these gladiators were actually the athletes of their day, and it was high stakes. You go to a football game, yeah, maybe you get a concussion or something, but with the gladiators, these were fights to the death, and so these were folks that had been captured in battle in Rome's overseas conquests, and then they are shipped back to Rome and also other places inside. It's almost like there was a minor leagues of gladiators, so that these gladiator games were not just in the city of Rome; they were really all over the place. But they become almost like an attraction. And so there's an increasing number of them, and they are not being treated very well. Now, some of the aftershocks, so that's kind of what we're going to talk about right now is the slave revolt. There's actually a really good movie made in the 50s and 60s with Kirk Douglas called Spartacus. And so Spartacus was the slave that ended up leading this gladiator revolt. Now, when Sulla dies, his two chief military lieutenants are Pompey and Crassus. And Pompey went to Spain to fight remnants of Marius's allies. Marius is long dead, but it was Marius and Sulla that had been fighting with each other over control of Rome. Sulla ended up winning, but when Sulla dies, some of Marius's old allies tried to regain some territory, particularly in Spain. So Pompey went down there to put an end to that. Another army was sent east to Pontus, and Pontus is an area along the Black Sea, right there. So if you look at that finger right there, that's where Pontus is. And Sulla had taken the Roman army there and had just about finished the job, but then he ended up having to turn around and come back because of what Marius was up to. And so there was some unfinished business militarily in Pontus, and another army is sent east to deal with that. So what ended up happening, excuse me, a moment. So what ended up happening was that most of the Roman army was not in Italy. And as a result, there was kind of an opportunity for some of these slaves and gladiators to sense that there was not as much law enforcement in the area, and they had deep complaints about how they were being treated. And there was a gladiator school that was in Capua. Capua was, I call it the Las Vegas of Rome. It was kind of where, it was fast and loose in terms of its morals and all of the rest. And in 73 BC, this infamous gladiator school, there were 78 gladiators that escaped and killed soldiers they basically went to the um, kitchen and got out kitchen knives and used them to kill the soldiers that were policing them in Capua. And one of their leaders was a man by the name of Spartacus. He was Thracian by birth, so that's the area north of Macedonia that's kind of on the way toward the Hellespont, which is where all the the Persians and the Seleucids had used to invade Europe. And he escaped, and he had been a military leader in Thrace, and so he had some military training. And he ended up building an army of 70,000 slaves. So this is quite a force. Now, they're not as well equipped as the Roman army, and but Spartacus was not your typical slave. He had had military experience, and he really just wanted to get out of Italy. He wanted to go home, but because there were lots of other people that were just going and filling his camp and urging him to proceed, he ended up somewhat, against his will, of actually leading this fight. And so at this point, some of those expeditions to the east and in Spain were finished, and a lot of the Roman army returns, and Crassus is given the assignment of ending the gladiator war. The first thing he did was that he decimated, and that word's a technical term, deci is 10. He decimated 10% of the army that had fled in the face of Spartacus's army. Spartacus tries to flee to Sicily, and he's about ready to. He thought that he had some support from some pirates down at the boot heel of Italy called Rhegium. Spartacus was trapped, but he managed to escape in a snowstorm. I can't imagine a snowstorm in Italy. And so Crassus is considered kind of a failure and having Spartacus escape. And so Pompey is sent back in as kind of a reinforcement. Now, one of his reputations is that he always ended up kind of taking credit for achievements that he actually wasn't really responsible for. So by the time Pompey had emerged on the scene, Crassus had actually gotten his act together and was actually just about ready to deal a knockout blow to the gladiator uprising. But Pompey gets there, kind of swoops in last minute, and is able to round up and capture many of the slaves, 6,000 freeing slaves, and they captured them. Many of them were killed on the spot, and one of the most kind of, there's this famous road that hugs the west coast of Italy from Capua and Campania up to Rome. It's called the Appian Way. Later, there were, as Christianity achieves, increases in popularity after the birth of Christ, many pilgrims would use, that Appian Way to go up to Rome. Anyway, they crucified 6,000 of these gladiators on crucifixes, one after the other. 6,000 of them from Capua all the way up. I think it was like over 100 miles. And they burned them. And so they said that you could actually, and they did it at night, that you could actually see Rome from Capua because of the burning crosses on the road to Rome. So, this is just really brutal stuff. But it also shows you that there's a massive amount of unrest in Rome itself and Italy itself because of this kind of political upheaval that's been going on. And it also shows you that both Pompey and Crassus are very, very politically ambitious, motivated, and willing to use really any tactics. You talk about ends justifying the means. There's very little that they're not willing to do in order to maintain power. But are they trying to do this for anything other than their own glory and their own power? Really, no. Pompey and Crassus, learned at the feet of Sulla, and Sulla was cut out of the same cloth. These are just a classic example of a tyrant. And so in 70 BC, after they've put down this gladiator war, Crassus and Pompey are elected consuls. And of course, they were supposed to be consuls for 1-year terms, but they kept power a lot longer than 1 year. Now, there was internal squabbling between both of them. There's a lot of competition rivalry between these two men. But in some ways, there's kind of almost like a fatigue on the part of the Roman people for all this fighting and civil war. So in some ways, even though these guys are not, not nice fellows, there's a certain amount of stability that ends up becoming kind of established as a result of them gaining power. There was actually a slight decline in political corruption, and you also had somebody by the name of Cicero, who I really like. Cicero's kind of one of the kind of unsung heroes during this time. He's really trying to keep the Republic from descending into anarchy and chaos. So he's actually fighting. He's a lawyer, and he's and also a politician, and he's trying to root out political corruption. And so one of the things you'll be reading next week is Cicero's famous speech condemning Catiline, who was also a rebel who was trying to take over Rome. So anyway, Cicero was on the scene. So there's this kind of lull of problems. Now, Pompey was given the task in 68 BC to try to deal with some problems of piracy out into the Mediterranean. It was a very successful campaign, even though the Senate was a bit worried of giving him too much power. But Pompey's got power, and he's utilizing it. And we also see the emergence of another rising star in the political firmament, and that is a guy by the name of Julius Caesar. And he ends up kind of his clan, the Julii clan. We saw them when you had the civil war between between Sulla and Marius. He was on the wrong side of that fight, and his great-grandfather or grandfather had to escape persecution and destruction at the hands of Sulla. So, if Sulla had actually killed his grandfather, you don't talk about Julius Caesar. Maybe the whole history of Rome changes. But anyway, that doesn't happen. And they had been a patrician family, but they were very poor and had fallen on hard times. And so both Caesar and Cicero are considered, and if this is the name of the chapter 78, they were considered new men, meaning they were not from kind of royal, rich, powerful blood, but these were people who had kind of worked hard, very skillful, whether it was in rhetoric or military tactics, in the case of Caesar. And so Caesar actually catches the attention of Pompey and marries Pompey's daughter. Okay, so there was, and Julius Caesar's married more than a couple of times, and what some of these guys start doing is they start cementing their political relationships with marriages. So by Caesar marrying Pompey's daughter, that's kind of a close political connection. And Caesar is going to reciprocate in kind down the road in a way that's really kind of ridiculous. But we'll get to that in a second. Um, at the same time, Pompey then leaves Rome and heads back to Pontus. And this is in 66 BC. He ends up defeating those remaining elements of rebellion, and then he hightails it to Jerusalem. Okay, so you look at that map right there. Okay, and so the last time we talked about the Jews, they had been part of the Seleucid Empire, and Rome had actually signed a treaty of friendship with the the Hebrews, to try to kind of fend off some of the Seleucid influence. That ended up not working at that time, but by the time that Pompey gets there, the Seleucid Empire has been pushed way back, and actually they're going to be replaced on the map by the Parthians. The Parthians end up taking over the Seleucid Empire, and that's going to end up becoming an enemy of the Roman Empire after the Republic falls. But we won't get to that in this class. That's for next year, actually. So Pompey is kind of making the rounds, and he has this Roman army, and he heads to Palestine and Syria, and he conquers those Seleucid holdings there, because the Seleucid Empire had been very significantly weakened. He goes to Jerusalem. He defiles the temple, but he also gives Jerusalem back to the Jews, and he ends up establishing what they call a high priest system, an ethnarch, like Herod or Caiaphas, or and also a military governor like a praetor, which would be kind of like Pilate. And the high priest will report to a Roman governor, and Syria, which is the larger area that Palestine is under, becomes an official territory of the Roman Republic. It says here on the top of 685, Pompey appointed a priest named John Hyrcanus to be high priest and ethnarch, a combined religious and secular office. The priest would run Palestine for Rome and report to a Roman governor. And you get to, I think Luke says when Christ is born, when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And then, of course, when we just went through Easter and Lent and Holy Week, where it's a successor a governor of Syria, which is Pontius Pilate. And so that's where you get this kind of role that Rome is playing when Christ is living as a man, a God-man in Israel. Okay, so that's what's happening, and that's just another part of the empire now for Rome. Okay, so next we want to talk about, this is beginning on page 685, we want to talk a little bit about, specifically about two men, Cicero and Caesar. And again, Plutarch is going to give us a lot more detail about these two guys, but Bauer kind of gives you kind of the short and the sweet. Both men are ambitious, and both men are looking for opportunities to prove themselves in the political world. So in 65 BC, Caesar is elected to a financial office, which is called an aedile, which is kind of like a treasurer. In 63 BC, he is appointed Pontifex Maximus, which is high priest for the Roman state religion. Now, that sounds like completely strange to us, that it'd be like us electing our priests and our popes, as residents of the United States, because there was really no other type of religion. There was the state religion, and that was really it, except for if you were Jewish, and that's why the Jews were always they didn't fit very well into the Roman system, because they were not willing to worship any other god but Yahweh. So, it's hard to imagine Julius Caesar, probably one of the most ungodly men in world history. He was a pope. That's what we call the pontiff, right? The pope. He was the head of the state church of Rome. At the same time, Cicero's moving up in the world after he is elected consul, and he uses that perch to actually finally condemn Catiline, impeach him, and actually uses a military to overthrow the rebellion that is happening during that period of time. At the same time, Crassus is getting very, very rich as governor of Spain, basically Iberia, and then he gives Caesar an opportunity to run Spain himself, particularly because he wanted to help Caesar pay back his debts that he had actually incurred to Crassus. You know, the word crass, meaning kind of materialistic, comes from this man's name. So Crassus is crass. And but anyway, Crassus gives Julius Caesar a plum political appointment that he knows he will be able to skim off the top and basically embezzle money in order to become rich as a public official. So by 59 BC, these three men who had begun, certain political and personal relationships decide that they're actually going to cement this alliance in a formal way. Again, completely outside of the Republican kind of system that had been put in place since really, 500 and 400 BC. So Caesar returns from Spain. His debts have been expunged, and he cuts a deal with Pompey, who's really kind of the military leader of the two. I mean, Caesar ends up becoming a military hero, but not yet. Crassus is more like the inside money man. He's a financier and a businessman. And then Caesar is younger than both of them, but they both men sense kind of a charisma about Caesar. And this is always the case. You've got kind of older men who think, oh, you know what, we're looking at this young guy, this up and comer. Maybe we can use him as almost like a figurehead. He's popular with the people, good looking, ambitious. So we'll bring him into the fold, and what they hoped is that they would kind of pull the strings behind the scenes. The problem with somebody like a Julius Caesar is that he is not interested at all at having his strings pulled. And what ends up happening is that he turns the tables on these two guys. But all three of them, and then there's a game in basketball called 21, and instead of playing one-on-one, you've got three guys, and each person is playing for themselves. Well, what ends up happening with 21 is that depending upon who's got the ball, if I decide to go out and play the defender, then the person behind me doesn't have to, and so he's going to be better. He's going to be in a better position to get the rebound if the guy misses. Now, if I don't play on him, the guy with the ball, and the other guy doesn't, then this guy's going to come up, hit an easy basket, and then we both lose. So there's this kind of wariness. Okay, who's both are two against one versus two, or three equal, whatever, and that's kind of what is happening here. But right now, all three are united on one principle, which is to have all of the power in Rome. So Pompey and Caesar support. Pompey and Crassus support Caesar's desire to become consul, and they would push for laws to favor veterans for Pompey, and Crassus was a little bit more difficult to kind of convince that this was actually worth it, but there are promises that there would be certain financial regulations that would be put into place to help Crassus' businesses. And then Caesar had a daughter who was going to be married to someone she actually loved. But Caesar decides, okay, in order to please the old man, He breaks the engagement of his daughter to her loved one and promises her to Pompey, who is 25 years older than the daughter. So, that gives you an idea of kind of how they're manipulating even their family members in this kind of desire to be powerful. So, Caesar becomes consul, and he kind of acts like a tribune. And if you think about what that means, a consul is supposed to be somebody who's representing kind of the elites, and they're supposed to kind of keep the public kind of in their place, so to speak. Tribunes are much more democratic in nature. They're much more kind of doing the will of the common man. Well, Caesar, in the role of consul, is kind of acting like a tribune, and you might say that Julius Caesar is Tiberius Gracchus without any scruples, without any conscience. He has no problem doing unconstitutional things. And at least with Tiberius Gracchus, he was conflicted about it. Caesar is not. So he's throwing money at this interest, throwing money at that end, giving free grain to the people. This is where you start to hear the phrase "bread and circuses." What's one of the ways to keep the people at down and satisfied? You entertain them, you amuse them, and you feed them. So they don't have empty bellies, and then they're almost like amused to death. And that actually helps people govern, in the sense of these people aren't going to be asking or demanding anything, because they're going to be kind of servile and willing to just sit back and not really care about what these politicians are doing. Come here. Dog is back. So, so Caesar is not acting like a council traditionally would. Pompey has sent soldiers to keep the Senate in line, and then Caesar, after his 1 year as consul, he is appointed the governor of Transalpine Gaul, and Gaul is right here. This is present-day France. Remember, the Gauls were the ones that had burned Rome way back when in 390 BC, and now it's a province of the Roman Republic. And so this is an opportunity. It's kind of a tough job. It's not really, the eastern part, Syria, Palestine, those areas, that's where a lot of the wealth was and the glamour. Egypt would be another place too. So being the head of Gaul would be kind of like being, what would be a more prestigious, military, to be the head of the American forces, let's say against Russia or against China, or, maybe you send them out to, I don't know, you're defending the, just trying to think of someplace that's kind of pretty backwater. Maybe you get to defend, America against Canada or something like that. So it wasn't a plum job. So he's kind of paying his dues. But what he ends up doing is he ends up having a lot of military success. And as a result, he ends up writing. These are, Caesar's diaries. He's writing during camp, and it's almost like he's writing newspaper articles about himself. And it's almost like a travel log. And he's sending all these reports back to Rome. And, it's an example of using the media to build up your personality and your popularity. And so after he pushes back certain Celtic tribes on the western side of the Alps, he goes all the way to the Rhine River. And so he ends up kind of self-promoting himself and backing it up with some actions. And so by the time he returns to the eastern side of the Alps, he establishes a military camp near the river of Rubicon. And this is one of the famous lines in Roman history: Caesar crossing the Rubicon. It was basically in northern Italy near Lucca, and that's where he set up his base of support. And really, what starts to happen is that he's gaining in popularity, and people are like go and see him, and he's kind of conducting business, and this is starting to really annoy his fellow triumvirates, Crassus and Pompey. So they end up going to the Rubicon to kind of say, hey, we need to renegotiate the terms of this deal. The other thing that he's doing is that he is bribing people who are coming to see him. So he's gaining power in kind of nefarious ways. So you can kind of see that he's a combination of Tiberius Gracchus, but he's also corrupt. And he doesn't really care. And he's popular with the people, and he represents a significant threat. And soon Pompey and Crassus start to realize that they've kind of created a monster here with Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar's kind of a cool cucumber. He doesn't say a lot, but he's popular, and he's letting his actions and his bribery speak for him. So this is by 56 BC. Crassus and Pompey arrive at the Rubicon camp of Julius Caesar and then negotiate new terms of the deal. Crassus and Pompey want power back, so they end up becoming consuls again, which is again another thing that is not consistent with the Roman constitution. Caesar is appointed another 5 years in Gaul. Pompey, after the consulship, Crassus is given military command, and he is sent eastward to try to attack the Parthians. So one of the things that Crassus didn't have, that both Caesar and Pompey have, are military exploits and military victories. So Crassus wants to kind of complement his kind of financial acumen with some military triumphs. So he goes and he is sent east beyond what present-day Iraq to try to fight the Parthians, which is east of Syria. Pompey is done with fighting, and he gets the governorship of Spain, which is a very lucrative place. There's a lot of agriculture going on there, and so it's a place to kind of get rich as a public official. So he goes. So you can kind of see what are they doing? They're rotating these offices, right? Okay, you get to be consul, you get to be praetor, you get to be the head of the military, and everyone's supposed to be really happy. But all three of them are looking over their shoulders, wondering who's more popular, who's on the rise, and who's on the decline. And of course, the person that's not involved in any of this is Cicero, and Cicero is trying to figure out, what's the way that we can get this thing back to a republic. Who do I hitch my wagon to? Should I try to moderate Caesar? Crassus and Pompey seem a little bit more difficult to deal with. So there's some initial desire on the part of Cicero to kind of try to work with Julius Caesar. One of the critiques of Cicero, and I think Plutarch makes it, is that he's a little too ambitious for his own good. Bribery is now rampant. It assured Crassus and Pompey consulships 15 years after they were first appointed. Caesar is appointed to Gaul, and in 55 BC, he decides that he's actually going to extend Rome's power and influence to England. And so I think, I'm trying to think, Albion. So they used to Rome called England Albion, which was a Latin term for end of the earth. So this was kind of the farthest that the Roman forces are going to extend to toward the west. And so and you can, when you go to England today, you can go see some of these Roman ruins that were still there, that were established by people like Julius Caesar and people who came later. So that's it for the first part of chapter 78. So at this point, the first triumvirate is operating. It's again, there's nothing formal about it. It's just these three guys who've got power by virtue of their money, their military influence, and really for Caesar, he's kind of he's almost like a rock star, if you can think about it. He's almost like a celebrity. He's kind of created his own label or brand, and increasingly he's going to be the one that both of these other Pompey and Crassus, we need to take this guy down. So with that, for the homework is to finish up the chapter 688 to 696. It's jam-packed with a lot of information, and this is where you get the famous phrase "Et tu, Brute," which is, "And you, Brutus, are you the one who's actually following through and trying to assassinate me?" So by the end of this chapter, Julius Caesar will be dead. One of his chief lieutenants, Mark Antony, will be kind of over the body. And so when Shakespeare writes his play, he's actually using the example of Julius Caesar and Brutus and Mark Antony to make a point about what he is seeing in the politics of Elizabethan England at the time. But both when Shakespeare is writing and when Caesar and Brutus are living, there's a lot of political rebellion that's going on. And so by the time you get to this chapter, by 44 BC, Julius Caesar will have been stabbed by the Senate. Okay? So that's all I have. We will see you tomorrow.